Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We are so happy that you're here with us today. We hope you had a wonderful Labor Day weekend. We are very excited to be on episode 10 of our Anti-Federalist versus the Federalist papers with our distinguished guest, Professor Gordon Lloyd, who actually helped us design this study. So if you've enjoyed this study, be sure and type something in the Q&A and let Professor Lloyd know how much you've enjoyed the way that he's helped us structure this program. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce a few people on our panel today. We're going to start with Aubrey Jackman, who is our media director. And while I'm talking about Aubrey, she's going to put a poll up so we can find out who's in our audience. If you could let us know if you're a student, a teacher, a parent, grandparent with children, donor, press, family, friend, just how you're connected to us. It would help us structure our comments a little bit more as we go through our program today. Now, while I'm giving you a chance to answer that poll, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Aubrey. Aubrey, as I said, is our media director and responsible for all the fabulous technology. Aubrey's also this year's We the Future Best College STEM winner. Aubrey's born and raised in Utah in the middle of 7 children. She's a student at Brigham Young University and aspires to be an athletic coach. So Aubrey, would you like to say hello?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. I just want to thank everyone for always participating in these polls. It really helps us out to know who is with us today. So to share those results with everyone, we have 29% of parent and grandparents with children. And then we have 17% middle and high school students with us today, 17% friends, 17% fans, and then we also have 13% teachers and 8% donors. So thank you all for joining us today.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Aubrey. And speaking of donors, I want to take a moment and recognize our sponsors for today, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Zimmerman from Houston, Texas. Now, Janine and I first met the Zimmermans when they attended one of our Founding Father forums in Houston in 2016, and the Zimmermans have become more and more involved with Constituting America as the years have gone by. This past year, we want to thank the Zimmermans especially for very graciously sponsoring our winter mentor trip, which we are postponing the trip until next year because of COVID. The Zimmermans are right there sponsoring the trip when it happens. But in addition to sponsoring this chat, they are also sponsoring our Constitution Day live stream, which you're going to be hearing a little bit more about later in the program. But if you go on our website and click on Constitution Day, September 17th, you can sign up for it. You'll see the Zimmermans' name there as sponsors of that program as well. They're also big supporters of our online auction and even bought a VIP Mount Vernon tour with me whenever they make it to DC. So Mr. and Mrs. Zimmerman regularly introduce us to their friends and promote our Constitution education programs at every opportunity. So thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Zimmerman, for sponsoring our chat today. Now I'm going to go on and introduce our founder and co-president, the actress Janine Turner. Janine is famous for her role as Maggie O'Connell in television's Northern Exposure. She is the founder and co-president of Constituting America, which launched in 2010. And Janine is always acting, but she is also actively involved in teaching kids about the U.S. Constitution, having given over 540 speeches to classrooms across the country. And excitingly, Janine's going to be in a Hallmark movie coming up soon this month. So Janine, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Can you see me? There we go. Hi. Good to see y'all. Welcome to the show. Thrilled you're here. And we're going to have another great show because we have Professor Gordon Lloyd, and he's so fantastic. And I love this series, the Anti-Federalist versus the Federalist. It's been really inspiring. So we look forward to today's as well. Hey, yes, Lord Octon. I want to know a little bit more about Lord Octon. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, thank you, Janine. And one of the greatest things about working with Constituting America is that I get to work with Janine every day. And she just brings so much leadership and passion and hard work every day to Constituting America. So thank you, Janine, for all you do. Now, we also have with us today, Jewel and Jorn Gilbert, who are two of our former We the Future contest winners. Jewel is executive producer and Jorn is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud We the Future contest winners. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all the while revealing a colorblind world on stage. Jewel and Jorn are graduates of Moravian College, where they each earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Jewel and Jorn, would y'all like to say hello?
Hello, everybody, and hi again, Professor Gordon Lloyd.
Hello, sir.
Well, thank y'all. We're so excited to have you here. Now, last but not least, we will introduce Professor Gordon Lloyd. And today's topic is the powers of the new government. We're going to be looking at Brutus V, Agrippa VII, and Federalist 45. And if you haven't had a chance to read those papers and during the chat want to go on and scan them a little bit, you can just go to our website at constitutingamerica.org, click Learn More on today's episode of Constitutional Chats, and you'll see those papers hyperlinked. But it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Gordon Lloyd. He is the Robert and Catherine Dockson Professor of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He's the co-author of 3 books on the American founding and sole author of a book on the political economy of the New Deal. And he's the creator, with the help of our friends at the Ashbrook Center, of 4 highly regarded websites on the origin of the Constitution. Professor Lloyd earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science at McGill University. And he completed all the coursework toward a doctorate in economics at the University of Chicago before receiving his Master of Arts and PhD degrees in government at Claremont Graduate School. Professor Lloyd is a frequent contributor to Constituting America's 90-Day Study Series, and we are grateful to him for helping us structure this important study on the Anti-Federalist Papers. Professor Lloyd has helped us break the series into 13 episodes where each week we compare an Anti-Federalist paper and a Federalist paper. And Professor Lloyd is going to tell you more about that and address today's topic. So Professor Lloyd, welcome to Constitutional Chats.
Thank you very much, Kathy. It's always good to be back and see familiar and friendly faces. And well done. Well, how do you want to begin today? Do you want to begin with me saying something, or are you asking me a question?
I think if you could just open with, maybe a 10-minute summary where you touch on the highlights and the papers that we're looking at today, and then just sort of tie them all together into the topic, which today our topic is power, the powers of the new government.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to learn with an innocent disposition, but I always try to tell myself and various students that try very hard to start with a certain degree of innocence. And that means approaching the past on its own terms, rather than all the terms that you know and therefore use to judge the past. You can do that later on, but you will never quite understand, and therefore your critique will not be that deep if you don't try to take it on the own terms. There's a certain phrase among historians which indicate that the present must reinterpret the past. Well, was that, one could use that as you must, you have to, you ought to. And then you could do it in a sort of a much more cynical or laughing way. They must do it. They must interpret the past. And so there's both there, you got to do it. It's required of you, and the other is that you can't help yourself. You just do it. So I would say the first point I want to make is to try to approach the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate on the issue of power with a certain degree of innocence. The innocence is this. We have something in front of us, the Articles of Confederation, in which the powers of the association, the confederation, the powers are expressly stated. If the power is not there, then the association can't do it. So how does it get the power that isn't there? Well, properly is you amend the document. It becomes very difficult because the document is signed by 13 states and it requires all 13 states to agree. So it becomes extremely difficult to add power if you haven't put it down there in the first place. So if you want to understand 1781, when the Articles of Confederation were adopted, to 1789, 1787, 1789, one huge issue is, does the Confederation have sufficient power to do the job that we want it to do? And if it doesn't, what do we do when it's very difficult to get it? Because Rhode Island will always say no. So there you have it. And it's out of that, shall we say, basic, that Washington, Madison, Hamilton said, this can't work. We've got to have a constitutional convention in Philadelphia to get to the bottom of this. And getting to the bottom of it meant they produced the Constitution. So that becomes the second innocent. Constitution is a response to the concerns that various people had over whether that country could last. I mean, we were doing very well at the state level, all state constitution doing fine, but there was no real United States. There was not really a country yet. We were still fumbling along. So this convention in Philadelphia produced this document, which, as we've seen before, is a question of compromise. And that doesn't make it dirty. I mean, there's a great art to compromise. There's a great art to prudence, which we seem to have lost. We seem to say, well, if you don't do it, if it's right and you don't do it, you're a hypocrite. Well, there are many ways that something can be right, but it's not quite the time to put it into effect. And so prudence comes in. All right. So you get the convention and you get this sort of compromise. Now, the document which comes out of Philadelphia, which is going to be commemorated on September the 17th, the document which comes out is now being seen by the public for the first time after 88 days of doing this. The articles are still operating because that's the government. You got the new proposal coming out, which no one has actually seen in the public except a few. And so now you have a debate in both indoors, in various chambers that ratify the Constitution for state laws, and this anti-federalist federalist debate that goes around the country. And so imagine somebody like Brutus picks up this document, which we all now reproducing and are going to commemorate in September the 7th, and he looks at it. He hasn't been there. He doesn't know how, for example, the Interstate Commerce Clause got there. But he does know that there's been a lot of discussion that we have to do something about improving the commerce from Georgia to New Hampshire because there have been all kinds of tariffs, all kinds of barriers. So there's a certain agreement that we need to reduce the regulations. So that's where you get him saying, let the natural commerce flow and all of that. So there's a certain agreement between both sides that we need to encourage or let loose, let nature play the course rather than barriers with regard to commerce. One of the things that the Articles of Confederation did not have was giving to Congress, the one branch, the power to tax. So how did Congress, under the Confederation, 1781 to 1787, get its money to operate? It had to beg. Please send money. So there were requisitions. And then that led to an argument, what would be a fair proportion for Virginia to pay? What would be a fair proportion for Rhode Island to pay? And there were quarrels. So what the Constitution did was to give Congress the power to tax. but it also added something for the common defense and general welfare. All right, now that how do we interpret that? When Brutus and Agrippa read that, they think, what can't be done under the general welfare and common defense clause? But just about anything can be done. And so the Federalist responds to that. Federalist 45 responds and says, the powers of the general government are few and defined. Don't start getting hyper on me and losing your common sense here. Are few and defined. The powers of the state governments are many and undefined. So Brutus's fear is a phrase like interstate commerce, which we should be done, will be expanded. The general welfare clause will become, you can drive a Mack truck through it. And the taxing clause will just put us in poverty. And it will lead to a great increase in power in the federal government. And it will lead to the taking away of power where people are used to at the local level. And Agrippa says, it's useless to tell us don't think about local interests. That's where we live. It's very difficult to think about far off interests. We're all local. Politics is all local. Life is all local. So you have this dispute. And it's a very interesting dispute which has great relevance today and through the New Deal. And what can the federal government do, and what do you want the federal government to do? And Madison's classic response in Federalist 45 is classic and has been used by many conservatives to arguing, no, you cannot do that, the general government. You're not allowed to do that. Remember, Madison in Federalist 45 says, the powers of the general government are few and defined. The powers of the state governments. So if you have this clash, and I will end on this note, Brutus and Agrippa think that the issue of the problem of power is that the general government is going to suck away the power. So you can imagine there are two issues. Will the union become concentrated in Washington, or will it devolve into secession among the states? Madison's fear is that there's not enough power in Washington and power in the states, and the union will be lost. Brutus and others are saying, no, watch those clauses, power will move straight to Washington, and the states will be reduced to ruin and rubble, and there will be no state life. So that is the issue. And Madison's response is, you're all being too hyper. You're all, what are you on? Mellow out. Stop your fears. Stop reading the book of Revelations. Stop thinking in apocalyptic things that are coming along. The powers of the general government are few and defined. And the powers of the general, and moreover, the people have their loyalty to the states, and the people will not let this happen. That power will go. The people will not let it happen. The very next paragraph, Madison says, all this depends on the preponderance of peace in our world. Because as soon as war comes, we expect it must happen that power will go to the general government. And if I were to be asked, well, so how does that all fit in today? Well, we've had a civil war, we've had World War I, we've had World War II, we've had a number of numerous, endless wars. But with it, we've also adopted the word war instead of deliberation for politics. So we have a war on terror, a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on low education, a war on housing. So if domestic politics becomes war, then you are going to find it very difficult for the state governments. So we end with, is Brutus correct? Or is Publius correct?
Okay, I'm not Mike. All right, wonderful as always.
I love you too.
Unless I ask you a quick question and don't give you time to answer it. That's when you get like,
No, no, you asked me questions. It's a wonderful questions. I'm about to answer. Oh, no, I don't want to. I don't want to take over here. You have a question?
I know it's the dilemma of an hour show.
All right, go ahead. You have time now.
Many intelligent people who want to be a part of this conversation. Okay, well, I remember in this paper that Madison said the people won't let it happen. And of course, it's happened. I mean, so the people have been, I think, asleep at the wheel. I think the Congress has been, the people have been asleep at the wheel and let Congress have too much power. And then Congress has been asleep at the wheel and let the executive branch have too much power. And now, but the people somehow let it happen, asleep at the wheel. It's really interesting. And I think of Adam Smith as far as the economy is concerned. They must have based this on the philosophy of Adam Smith. He was very much, if you just let the economy, because I watched a great documentary and they showed how if you could find people in the donut shops and all these places and the stores along his avenue, whenever he lived, I guess, 18th century, but if you just, it got constrained and things didn't happen, things didn't sell, products didn't sell. But if you just let people naturally go to where they wanted to go and let the business owners be thinkers and free to think and promote and do things how they wanted. I think they even showed, one grocery store decided to make a certain price, so the other store made match the price. If you give them freedom, then commerce can grow. So it's interesting, perhaps, and I guess this is one of my questions, perhaps as far as the economy is concerned, as far as the economy is concerned and the federal government not having too much power, the intention of the Federalists was great, but I think they believed in the power of the people a little too much, that we would really have more control over this process than we've been able to have. So in that respect, Brutus was right. It's too vague, the necessary and proper clause. Well, it's too vague. And in that respect, you're giving people, you're opening it up for too much power. I don't know where there's a question at all in that.
You want me to respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. That's the presence of Adam Smith. I think that both the Federalists, both Brutus and Publius, wanted a greater commercial freedom. The dominant model in the world at that time was something called mercantilism, where the state was heavily involved. And it took over from the church. So, what price shall we charge for this commodity? And the answer is, what is a just price or a proper price or a fair price? And who's to decide that? And one of the things that Adam Smith did, that's the mercantile system. What Adam Smith said, well, the pricing system should be left to a market. If you leave people alone, then they will trade, barter, and exchange. And one of his famous lines for me is, it's not from the benevolence, this is my adaptation, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, and the butcher, the baker, and the brewer that we get our meat, bread, and beer. It's not from the benevolence. We have to appeal to self-interest. And that is not selfishness. That is creating a society of self-reliant people rather than a society of beggars. Only beggars rely on the benevolence of someone else. Self-reliant people trade, and trade comes naturally. Now, I think Madison fully embraces that, which then leads him to the next Adam Smith issue is, and the larger the country under which this system can operate, the better off people are, the better off and wealthier the country is. So for Madison, that essentially means reducing the state boundaries so that you have one extended commercial atmosphere where people can trade and produce the kind of freedom that you are discussing, Janine. Now there's a certain reluctance by Brutus. And the reluctance is the following. We are used to boundaries. We're interested in what happens to Georgia. We're interested, it's only We're only coming to consider ourselves to be one America gingerly. We understand it for war. We understand it for sort of occasions which are rare. But the idea that you're going to have one free trade commercial area without our customs being protected, customs meaning habits being protected. There's something called being in Connecticut. We talked about this before, being in New York, being in such and such. Those customs and habits are being protected. But what commerce does is to break all those down and create one free custom area. It encourages freedom. But what Brutus is saying is that political power will follow that, and that the political power will now go to Washington. And even if you do have a free trade area, you will have a lack of trade, local trade, and you have a lack of local political power. And Madison does not really see the corruption of power coming from the politicians per se. He sees the corruption of power as coming from individuals fighting each other over property. Brutus is part of a tradition which still is very much in America. The problem of power is in the hands of the few, not the many. The power of the few to control, and they go to politics. And politics is all about power. You concentrate power, you'll get greater concentration of power. And power corrupts. And it corrupts absolutely. So this discussion today we're having about is where should power lie, and for what purposes? And for Brutus, go ahead.
Okay, two thoughts I had, because I only have about 4 minutes left to turn it over. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about how sort of limited Brutus was in their thinking, or Brutus were, because there's numerous people, I guess, was Brutus one person or many people anyway, in their thinking, is because if you look at history, because I've become this absolute archaeological, history fanatic, and I've watched all the shows, but the great trade routes weren't just in Egypt. It was people were shipping and trading and going all over the world and coming back. They've even noticed it, I think, even in Stonehenge, the amazing variety of archaeological finds that have been from so many different countries. So it seems weird that they'd want to constrict it to just the States. And my second thought, and then I'll turn over to Jewel and Jorn, is Amazon. I mean, did anybody ever think about Amazon? Talk about taking away. Now there again, there's an argument. That's the new wave. It's a private business, but Amazon has just globalized the delivery, and you can see all the local businesses going out of commission. So there's another sort of if you want to answer that in about 3 minutes, I'll turn it over.
Let me answer very quickly. I think you'll hit on something. Brutus is much more cautious and nervous about the extension of commerce, because is it even possible to say together commercial republic? Because republics of old have usually been small agrarian, trading among each other. If you walk through Wales, you mentioned Stanford, you walk through, I won't walk through Wales, I drive through Wales, you can tell where one little community begins and ends, because there's always a church, always a pub, always a such and such, and then the next church is within walking distance. What's it take to walk? So you have these special communities. And look at the different accents in these communities should come. And you think, my goodness, how is it? All across, you have the Cockney accent, and then the Scottish accent, and then the Welsh accent. How is it in one small country? Well, because things were local. And Brutus likes that locality, yet he likes commerce. So he can't have it both ways, but he wants to control it in some fashion. Madison, bring on commerce. For Madison, as for Adam Smith, the greatest achievements in the history of the world has been the extension of commerce, trade routes, later on Suez Canal, all of that. But there's something that goes along with that. And what goes along with that is the destruction of local norms and habits. It doesn't matter whether it's the indigenous peoples or things that your parents and grandparents lived with 30, 40 years ago. It's creative destruction, which is what you're talking about Amazon. And then there are robots doing things. So Brutus wants it, but he doesn't want it because he is part of a tradition which says, be careful, because you may get what you want. Commerce, they do this. And Madison is not scared of that. He just embraces it. People trade naturally. Faction occurs. How do you break it down? Get people interested in and love with themselves, to live with themselves, to be and not be beggars.
And it's such an interesting conversation. And Jewel and Joran, I'm just going to make this final comment and give it to you. As a Texan growing up with a small town, Texas town in 1962, when I was born, I was there like around 65, and the Piggly Wiggly and all the local
newspaper.
The local things that you love about York. And then I moved to New York City at the age of 15, and I was like, woo! And it was so different. I mean, I'd never had a bagel. I'd never had Haagen-Dazs. There was so much food I'd never seen before. And of course, now you can get everything everywhere. And so we are losing a certain amount of charm. And the community, the local communities and the townships have lost so much power. And yet even so it's just, I guess, a natural occurrence of growing. You're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't, because opening up the trade routes was just going to be a natural occurrence. People were going to want to know. It's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. They wanted the tea from China, the silk from China, and
exactly.
they wanted that in Egypt. But you do lose. I mean, if you and this is gonna be the last sentence I say. If you do look at these countries, they were very cosmopolitan. I mean, Greece had, Rome had all kinds of. They keep talking about Rome as a small republic. Well, maybe in the beginning. Of course, it grew, but they were filled with people from all over different walks of life. All these popular metropolises had people from different journeys. Okay, I do have to stop and turn over to Jewel and Joran. Jewel and Joran, you're on.
That's such an interesting discussion. My dad teaches adjunct economics and different courses around finance, and he was a banker for most of his career. So these were really interesting to read. And what I love about reading the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist is the Federalist Papers is that, unlike political discourse today, it really is an intellectual exercise, and we can learn from both. And there's not always just a clear cut, hey, this guy's right and this guy's wrong answer. It's so much more fulfilling. They're working off similar axioms. They see the world somewhat similar in as far as natural law, and then they argue, and you can be convinced by either one.
And that's the American conversation. And as long as it's kept within, the conversation's kept within boundaries whereby you don't scream at each other. And if you scream at each other, you agree that you go to sleep on it and wake up next morning, have coffee and say, I'm sorry, or whatever. But it's when you don't, it's when those things don't happen, it breaks down. It collapses. And the worst war, I think both sides would agree, and the worst war is a civil war. It's a war of one part of the country against itself. That is, you can understand, say, a war with another country. You can say, well, they're invading us. They're invading us to try to take away what we have. Well, that's grow up. That's life. Okay, but when you have a war within yourself, so to speak, it's suicide. And that kind of war is that the country is out of harmony with itself. And that's the danger, it seems to me. And what we're having here is, people are talking very pointedly at each other, but it's clear. These are in newspapers. We tend to forget. There's this tendency when we read when you're reading it, say, wow, this could be part of upper class, but that's not what you're saying. You're saying You can read it, you can get it, even though there's a 200+ year difference. You understand what the issue is. Does power corrupt? If it does, where is it coming from? Are there limits? What are we doing here? What is the point? I, I think as long as we keep that alive, this is just not upper class stuff. This is in the pubs. One of the things we have lost is the role of the newspaper in terms of
That's really interesting though, because when you think about the role of the newspaper and what your discussion was before this about commerce and a company like Amazon, well, the newspaper now is the newspaper's role is being fulfilled by social media.
That's correct.
And social media, I don't believe that certain companies like Facebook or even Amazon rose to their power through just free commerce, because they were given advantages that other businesses weren't. So as Janine was talking about her local shop and local businesses, and oftentimes they can't compete. Well, I can tell you from just what we do theater, that for us, the distribution channels, like for us to just do a show and have people come to it, we're starting at a disadvantage to larger corporate and particularly streaming sites. And we have to follow more regulations, more government involvement, more everything. And it's so a commercial republic. Are those two things possible together? Well, we have so much regulation, even in, if you just want to go, like, you just want to go build a shed and sell it as yourself. That's hard to do, because me and Jordan are going to do that. But then even though I can go on Amazon and buy one and have someone build it then for me, and that's okay, I can't do it because I don't have the right permits.
Well, now you've opened up very good, and I congratulate you for getting the right to permit out of a conversation between Agrippa, Brutus, and public. That is wonderful. And you know what? I didn't see that in chapter 4, the right to, but you know what? This is where it's going, and it's linked to Janine's point about the people being fooled themselves. Here's some. I think Brutus is concerned about the relationship between commerce and virtue. Commerce and republic, because the old-fashioned republics relied on virtue, the virtue of the people, and the virtue of the representatives. And how do you get virtue? You get virtue through education in churches, through restraints, the teaching of restraints, love thy neighbor, the teaching of all that. So republicanism and virtue, look out for thy neighbor. It's not just only religious, but it is sort of community-based, and that's what it means to be a republic. Commerce seems to do away with all of that. It seems to be on a different path. It's trading, that's no longer useful. Will it sell, etc. So there's this tension, at least in the mind of Brutus, who's more traditional. So Brutus is coming out of a tradition, and yet he has one foot in the tradition and he has one foot in modernity. And he doesn't want to lose this tradition because he knows how good the tradition is in terms of presenting decent people who will work hard and et cetera, et cetera. Madison has embraced modernity, by which I mean enlightenment. You don't need all of that stuff anymore. Trading will do it, so that you trade and people become responsible in a different way. And so that this issue of can you have a republic if you can keep it? Well, is the republic going to be commercial republic, which for Brutus means it's going to be much more difficult to keep the republic, because commerce has a way of destroying. It's in its very destruction of old things, it is opening up new markets with new products and new aspects of life. And that is the whole idea. So if you say 1492, well, that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, opened it up, the world had never been different. Wow, how exciting. Away from that old past with all this traditions, and you only go down and see Mrs. George at the end of the street. Or you say, well, what happened to the indigenous people? They're not being wiped out. They don't have any defense against this conflict. They don't have any, their tradition has been wiped out. Okay, so now you've got 1619. Well, the defining moment was the first time a slave arrived here. All right, then you have a history that develops from that. Well, how about 1620? That's the Mayflower Compact. So the history of America is really contracts and making agreements and discussions. So and on and on. You have to have a benchmark. You go such and such. Which tradition are we leaving? Which tradition are we going on? Can it be? So there's a march. There's the march going on. Well, finally, to try to tie your point with Janine's about the people giving it away. One of these days we need to talk more fully about the progressives, and maybe in the final session we will. Progressives came in the 1870s, 1880s as an offshoot of what was going on in Europe. Capitalism across, people will say, you know what, commerce, capitalism, and producing the division of labor, and people not going to the opera, and can you imagine it? There's America over there. There's no Mozart, there's no Beethoven. All you have is jazz. It's a certain looking down through the European nose at the American situation. And the progressives are sort of halfway between. They're in America, but they're listening to this critique. And one of the critiques they're listening to is the way in which big business, Hoover, Stanford, Huntington, the robber barons, etc., seem to be taking over America in the way in which Amazon seems to be taking over today. And so what can we do about that? And one answer that progressives give is regulate them. I mean, we can own them, which would be the European socialist way. Own them. So once we, the people, own them, they'll do what we, the people, want. But it's very difficult to make that work, as we've seen.
I want Jordan to be able to ask a question here. Sorry, Professor, because we're running into Kathy's time. But regulate, Jordan, isn't that interesting? Because we don't want regulation, but maybe there should be fair regulation. To Jules's point, if I'm going to have all these regulations to put a shed together, Amazon should have comparable regulations. That's a thought too. But anyway, Jordan, I want to make sure you get your questions in.
Yeah,
and
I was
Professor
really.
Gordon Lloyd, we like to try to get to Kathy by 10 till. Okay, go ahead.
Definitely entranced by what you're saying, Professor. But you made me want to ask the question: would you say that the progressives were the hinge point in where that leaving some tradition, picking up new tradition, the hinge point in where that may have set us on a more negative path of leaving tradition? Well, because you can leave tradition and still keep some, and it can be good and good for you. But what was the hinge? Well,
I think in the 1870s, 1880s, in Europe and in America, the idea that unbridled capitalism without any restraint at all was not good, and that you had certain immigration coming to the United States and seeing these houses and buildings and people living in filth. And Charles Dickens was writing and Marx was writing. So there's a certain critique of commerce. And that it really hasn't turned out, this is a critique, it really hasn't turned out the way the Adam Smith and say James Madison wanted. There's a certain sense in which Brutus was correct to worry about the breakdown of tradition and everything. So the progressives' answer, well, the Europeans' answer is own it. So you get ownership of railroads, ownership of coal mines, etc. The Americans never went that way, in my opinion. What they said is, let's regulate. And that's where the progressive movement comes in, so that you get these enlightened administrators who now, this is the time that you get colleges being start offering masters of business administration, masters of public administration. You start getting in the administrative state, so that people who run government are not the elected officials as much as these administrators who are properly trained and are supposed to be independent and neutral in politics. And the whole notion was to regulate the bad characteristics of capitalism while at the same time getting the benefits. And I think in doing that, you're going to get people say you're not going far enough, and you're going to get people who saying you're strangling the trade spirit. But I think one of the things that if you talk about the negative, one of the negative features I think of the progressive era is you and I, the rest of us, are incapable of really basically governing ourselves. The world has become so different, so complicated, that it takes an expertise in order to run government. So that the Anti-Federalists may be correct in terms of their warning, but they have nothing really relevant to offer us because they wanted small communities. The Federalists, they gave us commerce and trade in the world, etc., and they gave us good government. But they too are not, I mean, they lost. They wanted 6-year terms. I mean, the administrators basically have life terms. School teachers have life terms, basically. So you've got this administrative state emerging from the progressives, which is going to solve everything, and it can't. And the reason why it can't is because all of us, don't have that kind of. I mean, if you and I individually are incapable of governing ourselves because we don't have the talents, how can one administrator, 2 administrators have the talent to administer the entire country? So I think that is one of the legacies. And when Janine says we brought it on ourselves, Janine and I started talking at least 10 years ago about the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th Amendments. That's how I got introduced, Janine. And my point was that, and Janine was very big on the 17th Amendment actually brought a huge change to America, and that because it meant that now the people were going to elect their Senate representatives rather than the state legislatures. And my point is that, but the people brought that on themselves. It's a constitutional amendment. So that somehow progressivism, the administrative state, putting it in a hand, caught on with the people themselves. And the progressives, I know it sounds very odd, they wanted prohibition. They wanted things to be clean of the nastiness of the capitalists, clean of the nastiness that drink brings, clean of all of that kind of stuff. So they brought a prohibition, and the people listened to it. They passed a prohibition amendment. 10 years later, they altered it. But so if the people bring it on themselves, certainly one way to measure it is, did they pass an amendment? And then they had buyer's remorse and overcame the amendment. I mean, we could go on, but I think I've tried to answer your question. Do you have another one, or do we move on?
If there's one more, it has to be a literal 60-second lightning round because we're going into Kathy's time here. Just you couldn't ask Jordan. Just make it 60 seconds.
I'm going to be honest. I don't think I have a 60-second question.
Sorry.
I know. No, you're fine.
How about a 30-second question and a 30-second answer?
Go for it. Go for it.
No. I meant he's not going to be able to answer my other questions. It's going to take way too much time.
Questions?
No, he can answer it. You're just saying he can't answer it.
60 seconds.
Well, let's try. Let's just go for it. Ask Jordan. And
all right.
I was
gonna ask you back to Brutus VII and the powers of government.
Yes.
It says it repeats constantly, common defense and general welfare. Now I'm curious as to was the statement of general welfare maybe what Brutus thought was so ambiguous about government's powers, and
without that tag of general welfare, pretend for a moment that it was just in their power to tax for common defense. If you think the powers would have stayed more separated.
In the Constitutional Convention, the powers to tax were agreed to, because in the old Confederation, Congress didn't have the power to tax, which is why the country nearly collapsed. You need to have revenue other than begging. So they introduced the power to tax. So actually, the power to tax for the purpose of the common defense and general welfare was introduced as limitations on power to tax. You couldn't just tax for anything. It had to be common defense and it had to be general welfare. So in a sense, Publius is looking upon general welfare and common defense, and both of those are in the preamble to the Constitution also. It's something which is for everyone, right? It's not Brutus reading it, not being at the convention, not doing anything, just reading it, looking at it. He says, what isn't the general welfare? What, I mean, a hurricane in Louisiana now becomes general welfare. Why? Because the general welfare clause is there. We could pass a welfare state because we have the general welfare clause. And I think both Brutus and Madison would say, no, 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 no. That's not what we meant. But once you put something down on paper, which is a very American way of trying to acquire security, it's written down, it's in the book. Once that leaves your hand, no one knows how that got there. And all they have is a constitution which says common defense and general welfare. And they sit around in the Oval Office and they say, well, what is that? It's what we say it is.
Okay, so we're gonna have to go to Kathy now, but that's a great way to that's something to think about. That general welfare clause, I think we can say Brutus was right. It's way too broad. They won on that one, I think. Okay, Kathy, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Professor Lloyd. And I do have a general question. It seems that Federalist 45, Madison's biggest argument that absolute power will not corrupt absolutely, or, you know, that the federal government or the national government is not taking on too much power. He's using a federalism argument. He keeps pointing to the states, saying that the states have these powers. And one of the examples that Madison uses, which we've been talking about a little bit already in this chat, is the taxing. He says, if the federal government is to have collectors of revenue, the state governments will have theirs also. And he makes an argument that the state governments will have even more collectors of revenue than the national government, that the national governments will just be a few people over on the eastern seaboard. And that has just, you know, not played out in a lot of ways. Even considering the fact that many of the states don't even have a state income tax. And now, you know, because of the 16th Amendment, as you were speaking of, and the progressive movement, our country, our national government does have a national federal income tax. Just, do you think that the founders anticipated the chance that the national government would have an income tax eventually? Or do you think they truly believed we would never have an income tax at the national level?
That's very difficult to answer, but I think that they wouldn't look upon an income tax as necessarily a violation of the tax, and the fact that we have an amendment and people went for it, even if the framers didn't want one. We have one, and it's not just because of a few progressives cutting loose at midnight and inventing it. And we, the people, passed an income tax by a 16th Amendment, which is about, and Madison wants that. But if you ask Madison, what would I like to see happen through discussions? He said, I want the deliberate sense of the community to prevail. I do not want a quick use of an absolute power to prevail. And I can see in my mind, no better example of the deliberate sense of the community prevailing than an amendment being passed. so that we brought it on ourselves. But I think it's consistent as long as you don't misuse it. I think it's consistent with, certainly consistent with the Madison version. What I think Madison's, going back to your initial point, Madison's defense about the federal government is not going to take over and the power corrupts in the federal government is that people are attached to local communities. And I think if we bring that up to date, are people attached to their local communities in some way? Buy local,
Yeah.
right? We have that turnout for such and such a day. It's that local gal does good. You know, local newspaper says, look, at local gal went to Olympics. Local boy gets drafted in the baseball team. So to what extent is local? I mean, that is Madison's point. If localism is strong, Brutus's fear is just a fear. And he might as well not be listened to. You silly fellow. Localism is strong. And Brutus's point is that, I think, in response to that is, you folks will break down localism. Commerce, by in and of itself, breaks down localism.
Now, and speaking of local, one of our listeners, Sandy Thatcher, writes in, here in Texas, a good case can be made that the state government has engaged in overreach, preventing local governments, including school districts, from doing what they feel best for their citizens. What happened to the reference to the people in the 10th Amendment? Are you familiar with?
Yeah. But the language, it's very interesting. The language of the 10th Amendment says the powers that are not delegated. It doesn't say the powers not expressly. That would be the Articles of Confederation. So the powers not delegated, all right, are reserved to the states' respect, or to the people. Now, or to the people, the way I read that is that if the people wanted the federal government in some way to be involved in taxation, the people should have a right to say that, say like through the 16th Amendment. If the people want clearly women to have the right to vote all across the nation and not just in Montana or whatnot, the people have a right to say that. So that I see the 10th Amendment as some things will be reserved to the states, but if the people want to shift it upwards, then the people can. I don't read the 10th Amendment as the states over against the people living in local communities. I see it as the states over against the people as a nation wanting to have something done at the national level. And so that's always it. But when it comes to schools, it has been traditional as one of the things that the people become attached to is their local school and their local school district, and that's where school districts make their decisions. And so within the tradition of a state, there's even been more. When Brutus is talking about localism here, he's talking about the states versus the nation. But you can carry that out. That state may be the size of Texas. It may be the size of California in terms of population. And what will happen is not just that the states will have a power eroded towards the nation, but the local communities will have power eroded towards the states. So you have that issue. If we go back to the title, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We have at one level been looking at this issue between Brutus and Publius as state power as local versus national power. And we haven't got into the question that the listener sent in, which is what happens within a state. And I think we just put the 10th Amendment to one side a moment and just say, well, some states today are as big or bigger than what Brutus and Publius were talking about. So the same issue, if you put the federal government to one side, the same issue occurs. What business, for example, one might say, does the state legislature have in saying whether or not 1619 and 1776 should be taught in local districts? Hasn't it been traditional that schools are part of local districts? so as the nation has grown with regard to the states, yes, the states have grown with regard to the localities. And for example, living in Malibu, who runs that coastline? Well, it's supposed to be the people. The people of what? Nation? The people of California? So who decides that? Well, there's a California Coastal Commission. But who's on that commission? How does that decide? Where is it based? It's based in Sacramento. It's a part of a group of administrators who's happily no mess. And you have to put in permits and get this, that, and the other. What are we talking about? I just want to go to the beach.
Well,
so what is that's probably as local as they want. I mean, it takes 5 minutes. They want to go to the beach. No. You can't go because the gate is closed. It's only open between sunrise and sunset. And after that, you can be violated for violating what law? It's not a federal law you're violating. It's a state law. Where did that state law come from? A commission. Commission of what? Progressive intellectuals.
Well, and thank you, Professor Lloyd. We're just about out of time, but you have a great fan group here in our audience. Herb Johnston says, "This gentleman is the best for me so far. I'm comprehending. Great spirit. Thank you." And then Robert Zimmerman, our sponsor, also says, "Really interesting discussion." So thank you so much. You just bring so much wisdom to these chats, and we're very grateful.
I hope they all go now and have a good cup of coffee, or if we've done with prohibition and it's late, it's 5 o'clock. Have a drink on behalf of George Washington.
Professor, just one question. If we wanted to read the best defense of the general welfare clause, a conservative or maybe even to the point of a libertarian defense, is there one?
In contemporary literature?
Yes, contemporary.
Well, I think that in the contemporary literature there is nothing but suspicion with regard to the general welfare clause. I can't think of a libertarian defense of the general welfare clause.
Okay, thanks.
It's sitting there for power corrupting. It ought to be gone. If I were a libertarian, I would want some very, very strict things. I would want the general welfare clause to at some place to say, and this is what we mean by the general welfare. It has to happen in 3/4 of the states. 2, and this event must have been, you follow what I'm getting at? So you have so here we go back to our list. Again, so I think the libertarian would want a very specific definition rather than a defense.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, well said. Really great. Okay, Professor Gordon Lloyd, you rock.
Thank you.
Enjoy, and you're always so fascinating to listen to, and with your intellectualisms and questions. So thank you. Y'all are great.
Oh, you're great. You're wonderful. This is
and Kathy, always joy. So Professor Gordon Lloyd,
yes,
thank you so much. It's just been, of course, I'll just close with saying the new local versus government is USA versus globalism. That's where we are now.
Well,
that's a whole nother can of worms, but it's a similar.
But it's a similar kind of thing. To what extent shall you keep your own? Exactly, and Britain would say, no, we don't want you governing our marriage laws. We don't want you governing these kinds of things. Well,
yeah.
Continue this.
We'll table that discussion for.
All right, but you know what? I will.
305.
Kathy and friends, I will see you in the last episode.
Definitely.
All right, thank you, everybody.
I hope you have some good wrap-up questions for me. Let's wrap.
We'll get them ready.
Okay.
Next week, we have our friend, author Tara Ross, who's going to be discussing, is the Bill of Rights really necessary? And Federal Farmer 4, James Wilson's State House speech, and Federalist Paper 84. And we also want to encourage everybody to sign up for our live Constitution Day stream Friday, September 17th. We're going to be going for 5 hours, lots of different workshops, 25-minute workshops on all kinds of different ways that our student contest winners have incorporated the Constitution into songs, short films, essays, speeches. It's going to be really wonderful.
And we're reading the U.S. Constitution live. We start with an hour reading the Constitution live. It'll be Kathy and I will be there, and we'll have students. So in every workshop, it's Kathy and I are sort of monitoring.
I can see the brothers right now saying, being part of that workshop, when they get to the general welfare clause, they'll stop. Everybody stop. What is a libertarian understanding of general welfare? Come on. Common defense. What is such and such? So this, I'll end on this. Congress has the power to create an army. It says so. Congress has the power to create a navy. And when times change, an Air Force comes in, but it doesn't say specifically that Congress has the power to create an Air Force. So does Congress have the power to create an Air Force? Under one strict interpretation, the answer is no. Well, how loose can we be? And here's the great American way. What was the name of the first US Air Force? What was it called?
The U.S. Army
Air Corps. The Army Air Corps.
Yeah, we should have known that,
because
my dad was at West Point before there was an Air Force Academy. And my dad was at West Point and he chose Air Force.
So now we don't need to make that fine distinction, because we accept that an Air Force and running the Air Force is part of congressional power under the General Welfare and Common Defense Clause. But it doesn't say Air Force there. So how literal should we be? Or how common sense can we be? And how much do you write down? We don't write down Air Force in 1787. Darn it, if the framers wanted to create an Air Force in 1787, they would have put it there.
It's under the General Welfare Clause.
Common defense, exactly. Common defense. But then you're gonna come back at me as a libertarian and say, oh, well, then if you could shove the Air Force under common defense, you can shove anything. So we have to have a compromise. You know what the compromise is? Well, why don't we call it the Army Air Force, Army Air Corps? That way, we have compromised and we've gone on with our business.
Still getting done. You just get to get clever about it.
I'm trying to crank you up.
Yeah, we are. We're inspired. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Bye,
you, Gordon.
all.
See ya, Jewel and Jordan.
Yeah.
Bye, Kathy.
Put it up here. Bye-bye, Kathy. Bye-bye, Jules Jordan. Bye-bye. Leave me.